like to watch us. You know, on a Thursday at 8, we always like to get a public figure in to give them a bit of a quizzing about whichever area of the economy or society they're actively involved in. And today we're going to talk to somebody who I met about a year ago on Good Morning Britain, of all places. And he's a social housing campaigner. He's called Kwajo Tweneboa. And you're 24, aren't you, Kwajo?
Yes.
And you've become shall we say, you've become the Martin Lewis of the social housing sector?
That's a big boots to fill, but no, yeah.
What got you interested in social housing in the first place? Because you've got a real profile, and I think any housing organisation that gets a call or an email from you is probably slightly quaking in their boots.
Yeah, so I mean, it started off with me living in social housing myself, grew up in social housing, but it was terrible social housing conditions. I mean, I started off living in a converted car garage with my dad, my family, and then we moved into our permanent social home after many, many years, and it was falling to bits. We had cockroaches, mice, leaks, damp mould, all sorts of issues from moving in, but we were still expected to pay rent. My dad became ill. He was diagnosed with cancer. Over the space of a year, that progressed to stage 4, and he was receiving medical treatment in those conditions. He then passed away, and things went from bad to worse, and it got to a point where I had enough. I took pictures of the state of my home, my family's home, and I uploaded it to social media. Went viral. I then went around every single home on my estate, got them to send in pictures, videos, and spoke with residents, did the same, and then it was picked up by national news and went out as a top story and disgraced my landlord into spending millions in our local area.
So, I mean, quite an experience all round there.
Yeah.
What provoked you to carry on campaigning?
Well, do you know what? It's a strange...
Provoked is the wrong word. Encouraged you.
Yeah, I mean, I think my dad's story was a huge motivate for me, and the way in which my family was treated, the fact that I knew that others, especially on my estate, I set out just to help my neighbours and my estate, and then I realised from that point that others were reaching out to me from across London, and not just London, across the country too, and I thought, I can't stop here, I can't just pull the ladder up sort of behind me, I want to continue. And as time went on, a platform began to be built on social media, and people were completely outraged and horrified, and then it received political attention too.
And you've got to meet a lot of the leading politicians in this area. Are you at all encouraged by the way that they respond to what you're saying, or are you slightly depressed?
Oh, it's a mixture between the two, I think. I have to say, I mean, it was surreal meeting senior politicians and how campaigning just developed in the space of a year or 2 years. The fact that I was meeting the Secretary of State, Micheal Gove, and sitting down having conversations about housing and suggesting things that could potentially be implemented into the social housing regulation bill, which some of it was, but also meeting the likes of Sadiq Khan, Lisa Nandy, and sitting down and having conversations and telling them where the problems are, where I am seeing it as a grassroots campaigner. It was interesting. I mean, although we've got the social housing regulation bill now, there's still huge issues. My phone doesn't stop with complaints from residents living in absolutely, it can only be described as slum conditions, but also struggling in the private sector too. Do I believe that politicians really understand the scale of the problem at the moment? I'll say out of all Conservative MPs, I do believe that Micheal Gove is the one that understands the crisis and where the issues are the most. I've sat down, and that's only because he's met with the likes of Al Bishak's family, myself, Shelter, other campaigners too, and been out and about and been sort of handed it to see for what it actually is. And also I've met the Mayor of London and Lisa Nandy, like I mentioned, and explained where the problems are too. Have I seen enough change? Absolutely not. But then again, we have to remember this is 40 years of neglect of social housing in this country, and it's not going to be fixed overnight.
Think it goes back far.
Oh yeah, it does.
That,
Yeah.
I can remember, and I was probably about exactly your age. No, actually a little bit younger than you, when I first got into politics in Norwich, and I was responsible for campaigning in one of the biggest council estates in Norwich. I didn't come from that background, and I would knock on doors and people would invite me in, and I would look around and think, oh my God, how do they live like this?
Yeah.
And when I went to work for the local MP, about half the letters that he got were from council tenants giving examples of exactly the kind of thing that you're talking about. This was 1983. And I mean, a lot of people did then buy their council houses, and by the time the next election came around, the estate had been, I won't say transformed, but it looked very different. And I think that's where a lot of people think, well, if that's what it takes to make our estate better, where people buy their own houses, what a great thing. But of course now we're living with the consequences of the fact that social housing isn't there anymore for people.
No, absolutely. And do you know what? You saying that really annoys me. It's not the first time I've heard that, especially in regards to social housing and the length of time we've had problems here, because what that shows me is that politicians, local councillors have been aware that this is a problem that's existed for a very, very long time, but not enough has been done. It's not been seen as a priority. I've spoke to MPs only recently. I've spoke to several MPs that have told me housing and conditions of people's homes, especially in the private sector and social housing, takes up the majority of their casework. And that's when I'm sort of baffled, because I'm like, why is it not therefore being seen as the priority in government at the moment? But what we are seeing is this push for home ownership, when we've got a rental sector and social housing that's completely on its knees and has been decimated. 1.4 million people waiting to get into social housing. We're seeing record levels of homelessness. We're seeing people in the private sector struggling to pay their rent, and many, as a result, being evicted. Now, the only solution for them then is to turn to social housing. But like I said, we've got 1.4 million people waiting to get into social housing. I think it's only compounded by the cost of living crisis too, and coming off of the back of a global pandemic. But that's where the housing crisis is, and it's almost as if politicians at the moment are saying, go out and get your own home, but they're failing to understand how can people, especially in the private rental sector, if they're paying the majority of income on a monthly basis in rent, how are they possibly going to save in order to get onto the housing ladder? What they need to be doing is dealing with housing from bottom up, and then providing tenants with the opportunity, therefore, if they choose to get onto the housing ladder. But for some reason, that is just not the priority that's being seen at the moment.
And one way of doing it, if you say 1.4 million people, let's say there's an average of between 2 and 3 people in each family. So that would say you need to build 500 to 6,000 new social housing homes, which is about double the amount per year of houses that we're building at the moment, more generally, not social housing, but just general houses. Do you think that we've missed the boat in a way on that? Because there could have been an argument 3 or 4 years ago when interest rates were basically 0 to 1% to borrow the money to do that. The money would be paid back through the rents, and everyone's happy. But nobody did it.
No, exactly. And I think it's only made the situation worse. But
why did no one do it? Because it didn't need government to do it necessarily. You could have made a private sector company could have made a very good case for sort of borrowing the money, investing it in new houses, taking in the rents, and they make profits from it. I mean, that could have happened, but nobody in the private sector did it. No, it didn't happen. But I think it potentially was because, again, housing isn't seen as especially social housing isn't seen as the priority. And I definitely think they missed the boat with that, because what we're seeing now is huge level of people becoming homeless, and the rates of people waiting to get into social housing growing more and more month by month. And I think they should have, had they seen it back then, absolutely taken action. But I think for politicians, they're so sort of short term, instead of looking long term at costs of just allowing an issue like this to exist. And what they failed to realise is that long term, it's going to cost them a lot more to deal with the problem than fixing the solution short term. We'll come back to all of the. I particularly want to get your view on the news today from L&Q Homes, Britain's second biggest housing association. So we'll come back to that in a minute. Don't forget, if you would like to talk to Kwajo yourself, if you live in social housing and you're absolutely tearing your hair out about what to do with the state of your own property because your local either council or housing association just isn't interested, give us a call. Kwajo may have some really good advice for you as well. 0345 6060 973. Let's talk a little bit about you, because I'm fascinated by your background. We were talking earlier. Your father came here from Ghana, and you went back to Ghana you went to Ghana last year. Tell us about that. So I think it was last year, June.
I went to Ghana. My dad passed away in January 2020. And his sisters, my aunties and uncles wanted us to go back because I'd never met my grandma, my dad's mum. And so I decided to do that journey and go back there and surprise her, meet her for the first time.
She didn't know you were
she
going?
had no clue that I was going. We rocked up almost, and her vision's not great, but we managed to sneak in the house past her, and then she didn't even know my aunties were coming and uncles, and she hasn't seen them in years either. And she came out, and my auntie spoke to her, and she recognised her voice straight away and just completely broke down into tears. And I think, yeah, that's something I will remember, because my dad always said that he always wanted us to go back to Ghana to visit her together, but unfortunately that didn't happen.
Why did he come to this country?
That's an interesting question. I think for a better life, better opportunities. I mean, he worked as a carer for decades from when he came here, and he was someone that really cared about others. And I think at a young age, he probably thought the perfect place would be to come to the UK in order to sort of start a new life and leave his old life and family members behind. That's not that's not an easy decision for anyone, but to try and better his future. And yeah, he came over, he worked hard being a carer for a lot of the time for the elderly and vulnerable. I mean, he loved it. It was his only job, caring for others, and he would treat the patients he worked with as almost family. I remember he referred, although he had his mum in Ghana, he referred to some of the people he looked after, his brother or sister, or mum and dad in one case, which just goes to show how close he was to the people he worked for.
And when you went to Ghana, how long did you stay?
It's 10 days. It wasn't long enough. I wish I stayed longer.
See, if that was me, I think I would be thinking the whole time, if my dad hadn't made that decision to go, what would my life have been? How different would my life have been if I'd been born in Ghana?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, I probably would have had I probably wouldn't be here, first and foremost, but...
Because you wouldn't have met your mum.
Yeah, exactly. But I think life would have been very different in Ghana. It really is, a lot of people say, a really nice place, but it's not until you go there and you see it firsthand, just how amazing it is, and the people there too. I don't know where my life would have taken me then. I definitely think I would have still been in touch with the whole caring about injustice and that sort of thing. But I don't know what I would be doing right now.
Well, I suppose you can't know.
No.
Well, it's absolutely fascinating. We'll talk a little bit more, and then we'll go to the calls.
Yes.
Lots coming in already. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to talk to Kwajo about national housing policy or your own circumstances. I'm sure he'd be delighted to give you some advice if you can. He's very good at shaming bad landlords. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second as well. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 8:15.
LBC Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
18 minutes past 8, we have Kwajo Tweneboa with us, a social housing campaigner. We're going to come to your calls in a moment. But first, I have a text to read out. Ian, I knew Kwajo as a student in Mitcham. He's the most genuine, humble and talented person, and what he's accomplished for his community is truly amazing. You need to ask him to show you his artwork. Bit difficult in a radio studio. You need to ask... No, I've done that a bit. On a serious note, as an activist, what are your next steps? And it's from Miss Petrakis, your old D&T teacher.
Yeah, design and technology teacher, yeah. Oh, wow, no. Yeah, I do love art, but I've not managed to do it a lot in the last 2 years because of this campaigning work.
Should be very disappointed to hear that.
I know. Don't hate me too much. But in terms of the next step, I think I want to continue. I mean, pushing this idea of social housing and rented accommodation, especially in the run-up to an election, because I feel like political parties are going to do what we've been seeing for the last couple of election cycles, and that's pushing the idea of home ownership. But I think we are past that. We have an absolute crisis in the rental sector, and you cannot fix a housing crisis on broken foundations. Our broken foundations are right now is social housing in the private rented sector, and I want to continue that up until the election. I absolutely intend to, because I feel like people at home need to understand where it is we're going, what it is that we're being promised, and whether or not it's actually going to work. So I definitely want to continue that and just trying to help people living in poor conditions continue raising that profile and doing as much as I possibly can to help as many people at home.
Before you started on this work, did you have an idea of what you wanted to do as a career?
I was working in my secondary school, and I was just gonna I was studying too at the time, but I was just gonna continue doing that until I one day made it with my art, was the goal, because I absolutely love art and have done since I was young, and I really thought that would be the thing that I'd pursue. I would have never imagined 3 years ago that I'd be here right now speaking to you about housing and politics. But I feel very, very lucky to be in this position, and I absolutely understand how lucky I am to speak up on behalf of so many that have suffered and are continuing to suffer too. But hopefully I'll be able to basically balance that with continuing my art at some point, but not before the election, I don't think.
No, but when you're 34 rather than 24, do you have any idea what you'd like to be doing?
I don't know. I've toyed with the idea of potentially politics and going down that route. I like campaigning for now. I think my role very much is here doing what I'm doing, but I sometimes think, and people have asked me, if you really want to create change, sometimes you have to do it from within, and I'm always banging on about the lack of class diversity within Westminster. We have a diversity checklist and tick box exercise happening, but we don't really focus on class diversity, and I think we need more and more people that are in that actually represent the communities, people like me, people like my community, people of the States and whatnot. So who knows, potentially one day I might go into that.
You see, if I'd been Micheal Gove, I would have said, Kwajo, do you fancy being our candidate for Mayor of London?
Oh, well, who knows? I know the mayoral election's coming up, so we'll see.
Before we go to calls, I've got to get your reaction to this L&Q story. Now, rather than me telling our listeners what it's all about, it's probably better if you do.
Yes, so it's a report that's been put out as an investigation carried out by the Housing Ombudsman into L&Q and their failings, and I think it's pretty damning with the results that they've come out with. I believe they now have to pay out, I think it's over £145,000 in compensation to residents who have been living in situations with disrepair. And there were also a number of situations, I believed, where L&Q said that in order for them to pay out compensation, the residents will have to agree to keep their sort of issues and disrepair confidential, which I think is completely wrong, but I knew is something that had been going on within social housing for a very long time, and L&Q won't be the only ones doing it.
And they're not a rogue landlord. They are Britain's second biggest housing association. And I was saying to you before we came into the studio that I'd always thought of housing associations as being sort of very reputable bodies and sort of always did good. I mean, in comparison, I think, to local authority housing departments, which people always thought were inefficient, didn't really have the interest of the tenants at heart. But do you think that these organisations have just got too big, that they've swallowed up all of the sort of smaller ones, and they're just too big to manage now, and therefore these sorts of things happen?
Yeah, I do. I think especially our larger ones are too big to actually manage every single one of their estates or every single household that they have. They've become too focused on merging, and we're even seeing it now as of recent. Housing associations that I have been shaming for the last few years, more concerned with getting bigger and merging than getting the fundamentals right. And what that means is these organisations are getting bigger and bigger but failing in the same areas, and that level of fail is only growing, and we've seen it with L&Q in the situation with the Housing Ombudsman in their report.
And Micheal Gove, the Housing Secretary, he has sent the mother of all letters to L&Q. And I did think when I read it, I thought Kwajo could have written a lot of that. Do you think that, I mean, maybe you're the wrong person to answer this question, but I suspect that what you have told him in your meetings with him has actually informed him to be able to write this kind of letter to these people.
I hope so. I do. I know, like I mentioned earlier, he's seen some severe... I've shown him cases of homes that I've been into where people are living in absolutely diabolical conditions. And he's seen that, and he probably understands that people are having to pay rent for these conditions too. And I saw that letter, and I did say, I remember when I first met with him, that there needs to be a firmer stance taken against chief executives and boards of these large housing associations that are allowing tenants' health and safety to be put at risk, even 6 years on after Grenfell. So I was glad to see that letter. And I mean, I'd say the exact same thing.
He did it with the Rochdale one, didn't he, after the Our Bishak case?
Yeah, he did, and we saw the response after the Our Bishak case by the board of Rochdale Borough-wide Housing, and the way they dug their feet firmly into the ground. And it's been slightly different with L&Q today. They've sort of taken accountability, but it shouldn't be a thing where you take accountability or do the right thing when you are monumentally disgraced and you've got the Housing Secretary writing into you as the chief executive or board to say you are failing your tenants. It really shouldn't. You should be doing what is right. You won't have the Housing Secretary criticising you if you're doing and getting the fundamentals right. That's what they should be focusing on, rather than trying to absolve themselves of any responsibility or accountability.
And a housing association like L&Q, they can't come out with the excuses that a local council sometimes comes out with, saying, well, our budgets have been cut by 40%, blah, blah, blah. It's austerity. We just haven't got the resources. A housing association isn't in that position. They're not... I mean, they're more private sector than public sector, aren't they? So they ought to have the resources.
Yeah, especially these larger ones. I mean, you see they have surpluses in the hundreds of millions on a yearly basis. So it's not as if they don't have the money to invest in certain areas to get it right. But I think structurally these organisations are failing. And I think it's a cultural issue too, towards social housing tenants, that they simply haven't got right. That doesn't cost a thing to change that, and attitudes towards tenants. You look at Al Bishak and his parents and the way in which they were told they were lucky, the damp and mould in their homes being blamed on ritual bathing. These are all down to culture and attitude, stereotypes towards tenants, and this is what should be changed. But what we've seen from this report is that even over the last 2 years of me campaigning and the sector claiming that things are changing, what we're seeing from this is clearly it's not changing quick enough. I have to make the point though with local authorities too, they are just as bad as housing associations. If not, I find it even harder with local authorities in order to get through on behalf of other tenants and actually get a response from them. And yes, they do put it down to funding cuts, but I've said once or twice in the past when I've shamed them for allowing people, for example, to be living in disrepair for one case 10 years, I turned around when they used the excuse of funding and I said to them, so what was you doing to raise that as an issue and your concerns with funding, the fact that you can't do your job, before I came into your tenant's home and then disgraced you on social media for allowing them to live in slum conditions for the last 10 years? What were you doing to raise that? And often the answer to that is nothing, and clearly not enough.
Right, shall we go to a call? It's from Karen in Eltham. Karen, very good evening. What would you like to say to Kwajo?
Hi, Kwajo. I really appreciate your time, and there's so much disrepair. I don't even know where to start. I was really fortunate to talk to Lewis Goodall before, and he came and filmed here with the amount of mould in the home. And the fact that it's making my son really sick, and he's getting sicker and sicker. Greenwich Council, I've been to environmental health, housing rights, the MP. Nothing's changed. Social workers have sat and done nothing. Nobody's helping. The mould's getting worse. I concern for my son's carers because they're having to bleach off the mould. It's even in his drug cabinet that we have to keep his medicines. I'm going to cry. It's just outrageous. When it rains, it physically goes through the bedroom wall, so the shelves fall off the wall because they're so wet. The carpets have had to be pulled up because they're soaking wet, because when it rains, it goes through the walls, as well as the mould. We're showering in mould, and then I just can't win because we have to bleach it off because it's spreading everywhere, but then we're told not to bleach it off, so I can't win. And it's also the carers who, what happens if they get sick too? Because I've got asthma, I've got breathing problems. I can't prove it's the mould. My son's actually allergic to the mould.
And this has been going on for 4 years.
4 years, and even Lewis Goodall, he was lovely. He came in, and even he said that. So basically, what Greenwich have been doing is covering it up with thermoboard. So then the mould is, my son's consultant saying, but the mould spores are still behind. They're still coming out. So I go to no-win solicitors, but because it's been covered up, they won't take the job on. I've got parts of concrete falling out outside. The list goes on. The roof leaks, the chimney is apparently the cause of the mould, but I can't. The list is so bad.
The message is Greenwich Council, get your act together, but they haven't got that message, have they? Kwajo, I mean, you talk about shaming people on social media, which maybe does some good up to a point, but what would you advise Karen to do?
Oh, well, first thing is, if you have to, in those sorts of situations, and I advise any sort of tenant living in disrepair, is go to social media, because it's very quick. Social housing providers and councils are very quick to respond to a tweet, a lot quicker than they are to actually respond to calls in disrepair when you email into them. So sometimes you do have to shame them online. I'd also advise, I don't know, I'm assuming you followed the complaints procedure, but getting in contact with the Housing Ombudsman.
Yes.
Too.
And I've got no answer back.
Right, I see.
I've got no answer back. The thing is, I'm really sorry to interrupt, but I'm dyslexic, and I feel they take advantage of that. So I don't have social media as such, because it's not my way of communicating with the world. So
you shouldn't need to either. You shouldn't need to. Yeah, go ahead.
I just feel that that's taken advantage of.
And you shouldn't have to really go to social media, because Greenwich should be listening to what it is that they're contractually expected to do in regards to disrepair. Would you, I hope I'm allowed to ask, but would you be able to drop me an email after this call, and I'll see if there's anything I can do on my side to get in contact with them, but also the Housing Ombudsman?
Karen, thank you. I'd really appreciate that.
If you want to email me, I can pass it on.
Yeah, please, I'll ask Gavy's carers to help me do it, because
that'd be great.
Like I say, I'm not particularly good at emails and that. But yes, please, I'd really appreciate the support.
If you send it to me, send it to Iain, IAIN, @lbc.co.uk, and we'll pass it on to Kwajo. Just make sure you put Karen Social Housing Greenwich in the subject line, and then I'll immediately see it and know what it's about. I mean, you feel so helpless because Karen probably thinks she's the only one in the situation in some ways, but for every Karen in Eltham, there's another 1,000 or so probably throughout the country, more than 1,000,
no, a lot more,
who are just in despair because they've tried to do the right thing, go through the right system, get sort of rejections or no replies. And if they talk, I always advise people to go to their MPs, because there's nothing that a local council hates more than a complaint from the local MP. But if she's done that, and that hasn't brought any joy, you're her last hope. Don't want to put any pressure on you, Kwajo, but...
Well, it shouldn't be the case.
No, it shouldn't.
After our Bishop, we were told and we were promised issues like damp and mould would be dealt with and it will be treated seriously. But what we're seeing 4 years on, it's completely unacceptable. But in regards to MPs too, I've seen situations where local authorities, councils, and housing associations completely walk all over MPs in regards to their responses when they are challenged about disrepair, because they know the letters to send, they know exactly the wording that they have to send in order to sort of get an MP or councillor off of their back, and that's exactly what they do. And what that results in is tenants having multiple doors by people, the same agencies that are supposed to be looking after them, closed in their face. Carol listed it out, the amount of people she's complained to, and it shouldn't take all of that. It's a failing within local authorities and councils, and I think it comes down to caring too. I think that's the absolute fundamental of this, and what we're seeing is they don't care enough.
Right, we'll take more of your calls to Kwajo in just a few moments' time. It's 8:33 on LBC News Headlines with Daryl Jackson.
Consistently high temperatures across America and Europe mean records are likely to be broken. Despite not even reaching the end of July yet, scientists think it'll be the hottest month ever recorded, with the UN chief calling it an era of global boiling. A 26-year-old man's been told he will never be let out of prison for murdering Police Sergeant Matt Ratner in a custody cell in South London. Louis de Zoysa was sentenced for shooting the officer in September 2020. And U2 are among the latest musicians to continue their tributes to Sinead O'Connor, who's died at the age of 56. There's no medical cause of death yet, but police say she was found unresponsive at home. LBC weather: spells of rain in the far northeast tonight, the odd shower elsewhere with spells of cloud in the southeast and a low of 9 degrees.
LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
8:36. Kwajo Tweneboa is with us, a social housing campaign. He's taking your calls. Let's go to Janet, who's a new caller in Walthamstow. Where I used to live, Janet. Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Yes. I've been in temporary accommodation for about 15 years now. And there's a lot of disrepair in the house, such as rodents and a lot of damp. There's a lot of other fixtures that need to be done, like the floor is even falling apart, and it's caused problems to the property next door. There's a lot of, the bits where the wall should be, the skirting, it's not filled in. So there's rodents are able to come out from under there. It's just been a nightmare, and this has been going on ever since I've been in the property, actually. And passing the buck or, you know, just minimalising my experience and what's going on here. Yeah.
And it's a private management company.
Yeah, and that's Deborah Conway, yes.
Right, I see. It's very interesting because a lot of local authorities have private management companies that they then pass tenants over to, as opposed to house them in decent conditions. But we've learned that's not the case. Have you reached back out to the local authority in regards to complaining about the private management company and the conditions you're having to live in?
There's no way for me to there's no complaints because it is temporary accommodation. So they've kind of like, they throw their hands up saying that it's not them that I should be going to, it's the management services. So it goes between both of the two.
And they're sort of passing the blame back and forth.
Yeah.
Have you tried the housing ombudsman, reaching out to the housing ombudsman?
I haven't, but I have got their number somewhere, but I didn't actually go through with it.
Yeah, I think it would be a good move to make, especially if you've sort of collated the amount of sort of complaints that you've made and the times you've made it, how long you've been complaining for, and then make it clear that you've tried complaining to your management company, but not just the management company, also the local authority, but have got nowhere and you're having to live in disrepair. Have you got any children or is it just yourself?
Yeah, I have got children, yeah.
And
it's affected them severely, especially during exam times. In my son's room, there was a mouse running at about 3 o'clock in the morning, and he'd had exams going on, so that really did disturb him. And yeah, it's just unlivable, I feel, because there's nothing for them to eat at night. So then the rodents come in during the day. Yeah.
It sounds absolutely horrific. I think my advice in this situation is difficult because it's a private management company, but continue trying to complain to your local authority, but also reach out to the housing ombudsman with your complaint too, because...
And they have jurisdiction over private companies, do they?
Temporary, so it would be temporary accommodation. So I believe that the housing ombudsman will be able to get in contact with the local authority, whichever borough you're in. It's difficult with a private management company.
Forest.
Yes, Waltham Forest, because it's arm's length. But again, the local authority is providing that management company with money in order to house tenants in temporary accommodation. If they're failing to do their job, then that falls upon the local authority to do something about that.
Well, Janet, good luck. I mean, it just sounds horrific, particularly if you've been... I mean, it can't be temporary accommodation if you've lived in it for 15 years. It's ridiculous, isn't it? Angelica is in Battersea. Angelica, hello.
Hello, Ian. Hello, Kwajo.
Hiya.
Okay, I'm currently suing Peabody Trust, my landlords, because I've had 5 floods in this property. Majority of them were from the bathroom and the toilet area upstairs, from the flat above me, and all I could smell was their sewage through the whole ordeal. They finally, last month, they had the workmen out, but I was flooded in December 2020. The last 2 floods I'm suing them for, December 2020 and January 2022. And since 2020, I've been living with mould, mushrooms as big as my hand underneath the kitchen cupboards, and I didn't know they were there because, I can't get underneath the cupboards, but you could smell the mold. As soon as you come into the house, you could smell the mold. Underneath all my vinyl flooring I just had fitted a month before the flood in December 2020. So all of my flooring had to come up. I moved into this property with the clothes on my back and a bed, and I slept in my coat the first night, and I carpeted the whole place, and I got flooded. So I had to recarpet again, and they've had to repaint, remove skirting boards, remove all the old flooring, repaint everywhere, redecorate everywhere, replace cupboards. I'm on LBC radio, sorry. Come in. sorry about that. Tony, come in. And Tony's flat, he lives in the block of flats behind me. They have 4 floors, and the chute is stuck full up with rubbish all the way to the top. Can you imagine the maggots in there? And there's flies constantly in that block. And there's 3 disabled people that live in that block. And we've asked them for 3 slimline bids for 6 months ago. And they haven't even done that. So one's of council are what list. I've been pursuing my law case since April 2021. So, and I also lost my baby February 2021.
I'm sorry to hear that.
I had to also sue the hospital through negligence because they nicked my bowels. So I did speak to LBC before. They did say they'll put some solicitors in touch with me. That's why I was a bit wary of coming on to you now. So I'd rather just talk to you directly, Kwajo. But I have got a lawsuit, and the maximum they want to give is probably 6,000. And obviously, Wednesday, thank you, Wednesday, 6,000, I think, and I probably won't even get that because the lawyers are going to take half, 50%, plus the court fees, you know, and I've been here living with that.
I have to
My
say,
mental health
Angelica, if this is an ongoing legal case, I'm not sure we should go into any more detail on that. But, I mean, again, the circumstances here. Now, I mean, it seems, from what Angelica says, it's the flat above that sort of stuff leaks out of. But the story about the rubbish chute being full up, I mean, that surely is basic care that whoever's running that building, they have to make sure that people can throw the rubbish away properly.
Exactly. I mean, why are people having to pay things like, I don't know, council tax and service charges, let's say? It does sound absolutely appalling, and at the end of the day, these people are having to pay their rent. That's what the problem here, and clearly the job's not being done. I mean, the long list of disrepair that she's had over the last number of years, and the fact that she's had to legally take action twice, just goes to show what it is that tenants have to go through in order to get what it is that they deserve. And it cannot continue. It shouldn't have to continue. Tenants should not have to be going through this whilst having to pay rent every single month.
Right, let's take a text here. Eddie says, my 86-year-old mum lives in an over 55s housing association in Primrose Hill. There are 3 blocks with nearly 600 tenants. For the past year, the flats have had bugs, mice and cockroaches. The company sends exterminators in every few weeks, but they can't solve the problem. She has bought 3 new mattresses and been bitten constantly. She sleeps on her armchair to stop getting bitten. Nearly all the flats are suffering. I mean, again, I don't know what one can advise somebody in that situation, but it is just disgusting that it has been going on for so long.
Yeah, and it's mounted up to that, the fact that it's multiple homes being affected. I mean, in regards to rodents, under a lot of housing providers, if it is affecting multiple homes, it's the responsibility of your provider, so they should be dealing with it. I'd say in regards to that, again, I think collectively what they should do is get together and form a complaint and take it to the housing ombudsman in regards to that, and say that they've made complaints in the past. They said the housing provider said they've rectified it, but clearly there's evidence to the contrary. And raise it at that level, I think, is what is needed, because clearly the provider isn't doing enough in order to tackle it.
And how often does the housing ombudsman find in favour of the complainant? I mean, just rough percentages? Do you know?
I don't know if I don't know it off of the top of my head, but I know in regards to sort of legally, the majority.
Okay. Right, more calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973. We're talking to Kwajo Tweneboa. If people want to get in touch with you, you're on social media. How do they find you?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram, Twitter and TikTok at Kwajo Tweneboa. I changed my @ recently, so I had to remember that.
And that's spelled KWAJOTWENEBOA.
Yeah.
And if you didn't get that, you can listen back on Catch Up. It's 8:45.
LBC Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
It's 8:48. Going back to that text, Eddie has just texted back saying last year the residents contacted the local paper and their issues have been reported. But clearly not enough has been done about it. Right, let's go to Jamie, who's a new caller in Dartford. Jamie, hello.
Hiya.
Hello, what would you like to say?
Listening to all the previous people, it sounds like everybody in social housing at the minute seems to have all the same sort of problems, really. I mean, I live with my family, quite fortunately. I think I'm the same age as Kwajo, actually. So I'm quite fortunate at the minute. But we moved into our most recent social housing 6-7 years ago now. And it's just been one problem arises that gets half fixed, but because it didn't get fully fixed, it then causes another problem and then another problem. And it just sort of, every time someone comes out to fix something, it always ends up being another problem that doesn't fully get fixed. And it's just a long list of things, really.
What would you say the solution would be? I suppose for them to fix it properly in the first place is the trite answer. But is it the quality of the workmanship that the people who come to repair whatever needs repairing don't seem to know what they're doing? Or what is it?
Recently, actually, this week, we've had a few different trades come out, and we've had issues with damp. Our boiler was leaking where within the first year when we moved in, my mum noticed that the boiler was leaking. So she called up to get that fixed. It took almost, I think, 6 months to get someone out just to even look at it to see if it actually was leaking. So that was almost 5 years ago. And then leading up to now, because the boiler has still been leaking where it wasn't fixed properly, it's leaked slowly into the kitchen ceiling, all over the floor, and it's just caused damp and issues. And even when moving in, our kitchen wasn't levelled properly, and neither was our living room. So my mum and I think my dad sometimes would actually just get motion sickness just walking around the house because your eyes can't quite figure out what's uneven and what isn't. And it's just a pain, really. And one of the worst things is that in our kitchen as well, for whatever reason, I'm not sure, I think it was old piping that wasn't fixed properly. There was about a tennis ball-sized hole just in the wall that had a little bit of, I think, like insulator put in it. And that was it. That was their fix. And they put it behind a cabinet, and they never told us about it.
I mean, poor workmanship is huge within social housing, and it clearly sounds like a domino effect here. I often say that, especially these contractors that are used by local authorities and housing associations, have had a very, very easy ride over the last 2 years, 3 years when it's come to shining a light on poor social housing, when in a lot of cases they are to blame for a lot of people's misery. I would definitely advise to, and I'd say to absolutely everyone, every social housing tenant, is keep everything in writing, keep everything written down, whether that be emails or written down on a piece of paper. And also when it is you have complained, because that all acts as evidence when you do take the next step to complain, whether it be, again, to your housing provider, to your MP, to the housing ombudsman, or if you do consult a solicitor. But I know firsthand what it's like, and the sort of emotional and mental impact that sort of domino effect has of having an issue that gets worse because providers are reactive instead of proactive when it comes to complaints, and things just compounded and getting worse, and you feel like you're not being listened to. It feels like you're talking to a brick wall while still having to pay rent. I'm really sorry you're having to go through that. I don't know if you consulted your MP?
I have thought about it, but it seems to be, again, the communication goes out and then it's just not listened to. Because I know that... Well,
you don't know if you don't try. And I mean, a lot of MPs take these things very, very seriously. I mean, your MP is Gary Johnson, I think, in Dartford. Well worth a try. Because as I say, Local authority housing departments do not like getting complaining letters from MPs. Thank you very much, Jamie. Let's go to Alba, who's a new caller in Wandsworth. Hello, Alba.
Hi, good evening.
Hi.
Hi. A similar situation. I'm living in Wandsworth, and I'm living in a property for nearly 10 years now with 2 young boys. And the situation in the bathroom happened 5 years ago, which is a problem with the roofing. And they have come in and out to fix it, but they haven't fixed, basically. The issue, they come to paint the ceiling, and after 3 months, the ceiling come down again. So now the last 8 months, I have reported the job. They come to view it, have a look, and they send someone. They will paint it again after 3 months. A similar situation. And I said, you have to do something, not only painting, because I think the ceiling is coming down. The contractor they have sent around. They did. They said you need more than painting the ceiling. You have to completely do the plaster, and there is new material that you can put in order, to make it strong, the ceiling not to come down. But the council refusing, to do this job because it costs a lot of money. But it's very foolish because you have done the job over 5 times now, or 6 times, and you spend that amount of money with the contractor. Why you don't do the job once and forever? Do use all the material?
That would be far too sensible, Alba. I mean, it's just as clear as night follows day that's what should happen.
Yeah, and I fully believe local authorities and housing associations are wasting a lot of money in having to pay contractors to go in time and time again to fix a basic job that they should have got right first time. I've experienced that firsthand. I see it all the time when I speak to tenants. And what this sounds like too is there is an issue which they're not dealing with and instead plastering over it. It's almost as if there could be a leak from upstairs causing the ceiling to collapse. But instead what they're doing is putting a ceiling back up, painting over it without actually dealing with the leak. And a lot of people listening would think that's just common sense. But what I've learned about campaigning and going up and down the country, speaking to tenants living in disrepair, seeing loads of different situations, is that in some cases common sense just isn't used.
Alba, thank you very much for phoning in. Let's go to Bradley in Staines in Surrey. Hello, Bradley.
Yeah, hi there. I just thought I'd chip in a little bit. I'm in a WhatsApp group with some barristers and solicitors. I'm not legally qualified or anything like that. One thing I think will be a massive tip for your callers, definitely dealing with disrepair, is the Equality Act 2010. I'll read you a bit about the law. There's quite a bit, actually. It's really quite interesting because one of the barristers is quite excited about this. It basically says it is unlawful to suffer discrimination by your social housing provider because of your characteristics. Social housing organisation, your council housing association have a duty not to discriminate against you and your housing needs. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Go on to characteristics. It can be age, sex, race, colour, nationality, religion, belief, sexual orientation, disability, gender, reassignment, marriage and civil partnership. I mean, it's nuts the level it goes into. And then it goes on to, as well, so you could sue your council for basically indirect harassment, victimisation, direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, reasonable adjustments. It is nuts. So basically, what they've learned in these barristers is basically council, local authorities or landlords effectively just don't listen. So basically,
but that's not necessarily discrimination, is it? I mean, it's just basic incompetence.
It's very technical. But then you think the application of law is in itself, you could be any one of these features. And effectively, instead of they're actually suing people. There's loads of cases in the courts at the moment. And where people could basically get assistance, I guess. I mean, if they call,
hang on, Bradley, because we're reaching the end of the programme. But I mean, we're not talking about a housing department discriminating against someone because they're old or because they're gay or because they're black or they're Muslim or whatever. It's just rank incompetence, or am I wrong, Kwajo?
No, there are situations where I fully believe tenants are discriminated against based on their background, where they're from. We saw it with Our Bishak and the language that was used to describe his situation. Yeah. And I see it behind the scenes time and time again. My dad used to phone up our housing provider and he'd give his English middle name, which was Robert, as opposed to his Ghanaian name, because he thought he would be taken more seriously. And I see it and hear it time and time again where residents do that. So I definitely think there's an issue, and people with disabilities too. I mean, the way they're treated in social housing is absolutely horrific. This idea of the Equalities Act, and this is why I think it's so important with legislation to make sure it's enforced, is because we have the Equalities Act, and yes, we have Social Housing Regulation Bill, but if it's not enforced and no one's being penalised for not following it, then they're simply not going to do it, and that's what's been happening.
Well, I suspect this hour has been quite an eye-opener for some of our listeners. I mean, it's horrible to hear the state that some people's homes are in through no fault of their own, and the fact that no one in the local housing department or the housing association will take responsibility, and all power to your elbow in trying to encourage them to do so, Kwajo. Thank you very much for coming in. We'll have you back very, very soon. That's Kwajo Tweneboa there. In the next hour, we're going to talk about food again. We've done a lot of that over the past couple of weeks. We talked about vegans and vegetarians. Today, we're going to talk about pescatarians and vegetarians, because Keir Starmer, of all people, has revealed that he did not give his children meat until they were 10 years old. Now, what do you make of that? Because I'm not sure what I make of that. My first reaction was, really? That's tantamount to child abuse, which was obviously a completely over-the-top reaction. But he would no doubt say, well, we've got to think of the planet. We know that eating meat causes climate change, so we want to encourage our children not to do so. Tell you more a bit about this, and I want to hear your views in just a moment.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, UN